Oh, lovely to see you both today. We are going to have a conversation around what are some of the ways in which the culture of an organization has and how that can impact on how inclusive we are as employees. Start with you, Rochelle. What's your thoughts around this?
So when I was thinking about this, I kind of thought of my experiences of working in the banking industry, actually. And one of the things that came to mind was that kind of unspoken expectation that you'll sort of stay and work later than, maybe the standard 5:30 finish times. And if you sort of leave any earlier, then it's frowned upon. So there's almost like this, you'll stay for the wider team and sort of work over and above and beyond. That's the sort of unspoken expectation that's created. And I think sometimes that can really create a feeling of, oh, well, if I have a work-life balance that I'm trying to achieve, then how does that sort of fit in? So there's almost like, again, a culture around stay late, work to get the job done, show that you're committed through outside of working hours. And I think sometimes that can sort of create issues with regards to that kind of inclusivity piece.
Yeah, that's a really good. I had in my previous company, we actually made a point about it. So our hours used to be from 8 until 5. And I used to, at 5 o'clock, depending on the workload, but if we were okay in terms of we had done all the work, 5 o'clock, I was like, okay, that's it. It's your time is finished now, you can go home. Because I always was in that culture of, as you were saying, you're kind of expected just to stay late. And if it's seen as you're not working if you leave on time, which is bizarre, but a lot of companies have that culture. And it's a strange way to behave, because for me, I think it's about time management. If you're not able to do your work in the time you're supposed to,
you're not efficient.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually.
Yeah. So I have, it's quite, in a way, it's a similar story, and it's a bit sad in a way that those things, that what Rochelle mentioned still happens, because as I was telling you, I was recruited to an organization 30 years ago as the first female management hire, and at that time it was very much expected of me to fit in with the kind of very male boys culture that they had, which included, in addition to working late, it also included they had an officers' mess, so going up to the officers' mess in the evening and having a drink, a bit like going to the pub in England. And because in those days I did it because I was such an early female recruit, there was no choice about it. And I fitted in. Luckily, I didn't mind having a drink, so I went up and had a drink. And that was the way you networked and got to know people, and people got to see you. And that's how you progressed in the organization. What I find really sad is that now, many, many, many years later, after I've left and I do coaching, I get requests from young women working in that organization, coming to me for coaching and mentoring and asking me, how do I break through that glass ceiling? Because we don't, so I live in a South Asian country, so they say to me, we don't have a culture of drinking as women, we don't drink with the boys, but how else do I network in this organization? And I was thinking, they've got policies now well embedded about diversity, having recruiting women, promoting women, gender blind, merit-based, the policies there, but the culture has just not moved on in 30 years, so I think that's something that organizations really need to think about when they don't really look at their culture. I think sometimes they don't realize it's holding them back.
Yeah, I've been there as well. I've experienced that culture, and actually I've probably been guilty of creating that culture as well in some teams that I've managed, that social drinking culture outside of work. And for me, it's coming from the place of wanting to make sure everybody feels a part of the team, but actually not thinking about those people that don't actually want to do that activity, but thinking, this is a good way to socialize. But then the people that don't want to do it feel they have no option but to do it, because that's what, otherwise, like you said, they're going to be left out and they can't network any other way. But it's really interesting, because there's so many different, like you said, Keshini, there's so many things that you can, that an organization can put in place. But it's actually, is that going to change? Is that actually going to play out in real life? You know, because, and if you've got managers who are a certain way, they've been in the organization for a long way, they do things a certain way. Are they going to change the way they behave to ensure that makes that their people are feel included? So it's quite there's a lot of layers to it, isn't there? A lot of layers to it. But for me, I think a lot of it is around and when I think about it, I kind of think of the difference between the bigger organizations and the smaller startups, because I think it's a lot more difficult when you've got an established bigger organization to make those cultural changes, because it's embedded into the system and it's been in there for such a long time. It's kind of deep rooted. So to make those, and those tend to be the organizations that want to make the change, but it's difficult because they've got to change everything, like the whole culture, the whole way of thinking, to actually make those changes. Whereas the smaller companies, the startups, the smaller 15 to 20 people, that it's a lot easier to control that, because you've got a smaller amount of people. There's not such a hierarchy to go through, and those changes can be implemented and actually actioned and put into practice. Whereas the bigger organizations, there's a lot of blue tape, there's a lot of a bureaucracy to go through to actually make those changes, and also the people actually really want to do it, but they know that they should do, but it's like, yeah, okay, it's not really important.
Yeah.
The targets are the important thing, right? That's the thing that they've got to hit, and everything else is kind of secondary.
Yeah, I think it's something about culture becomes so embedded and it's almost second nature. So you really need new eyes to look at it. While when you're talking about a startup, they can set their culture from the beginning. They could decide this is how we're going to be. So it's much less, it's much easier to set up something that's more inclusive. But changing, I'm sure nobody thinks going for a drink is not an inclusive thing. But if you look at it with somebody else's eyes, maybe it's not. Maybe you need other ways of networking, other ways of interacting, and nobody's really thought about it. So
Yeah.
Culture is quite difficult to change. Creating a culture, changing a culture. I don't know. Have you ever had any quick wins around culture change, Rochelle? Have you ever?
Yeah, so I think of an experience where I've worked for an organisation which was very reward and recognition centric, and I think that was quite a quick win in essence, because what there were platforms where organisations really, or employees, were celebrated, not just for work ethic and work performance, but also things like living and breathing certain values. And for me, that really it really sort of spoke to people being able to turn up and be their authentic self at work and being praised for that. And I think that in turn brought a sense of belonging, if you like, in that respect, because people felt that they could just be themselves and they were actually celebrated for it. So for me, that rewarding recognition piece and those platforms that companies embed, they're really quick wins for inclusivity.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. But the point around values, I think, is a really interesting as well, because you can have a set of values that don't actually, they're just there, right? But they don't actually mean anything to you, or you actually do anything with those. You don't value those values. It's pointless, right? It's just words on a page. But actually putting that into practice and practicing what you preach, that can have a big impact on, if that's a part of everything that you do, that's going to have an impact in creating the inclusive culture that you're trying to get to.
Yeah, I really like that point about living the values and then being rewarded for that. That seems to me the way to get culture change really into the DNA of the organization. So I really like that. Yeah.
Have you seen things change from a HR perspective around this in the last few, Rochelle, recently, I guess, in the last few years?
Yes, I think it's the buzzwords, in all honesty. I think, it's the major talking point for all HR, departments. Everybody's looking at what they need to change going forward in order to support the employee experience, whether that's for existing employees or new staff members coming in. So it very much is a topical point of conversations. A lot of HR networking groups that I attend as well, it's almost like what are your organizations doing sort of differently, and how are you approaching this, especially in this new era that we're in, sort of post-COVID as well, and how people are just sort of thinking and feeling about themselves and about working with others and working in organizations. So absolutely, it's very topical right now.
Yeah. I imagine so. Like it's the buzzword, right? We're seeing it time and time again. It's just coming up in lots of conversations. But it's that remote working aspect of it as well is another big thing that affects the culture, right? Because we speak about it all the time, you know, being a part of the team, but being a part. And for example, on this call, we've got 3 different locations. I'm based in Brazil, Keshini's in Sri Lanka, you're in London. So we're able to come together and have this discussion as a team, but we're all based in different locations. But that is something that is difficult to continue that culture or create that culture if you're also spread out and you don't get to see each other. That's another thing that's on top of everything else that's going on. That's another problem that's brought into the mix. To how do you then deal with that on top of everything else that's going on? So lots of challenges.
Yeah,
that's a really good point.
It is. I think the whole thing about remote working is, on the one hand, you suddenly think, how do you bring everybody together and how do they feel one team, because they're all so far away, and on the other hand, I don't think the 3 of us would ever have had this chat if not for remote working.
If
we'd done a physical one, you'd have just picked 3 people in Brazil or 3 people in London. So it's incredibly inclusive in its own way as well, isn't it? It just depends on how you pull the levers and how you manage that.
That's a really great point. Actually, I didn't see that. I didn't even think of it in that way. I just thought about, we've got but that's so good. That's so true. But I think, you know, what it comes down to is that it's about a lot of it is, as we've kind of discussed, with the organization wanting to make the change, but actually, or saying that they want to make the change, but actually want to do. So it's like, you know, you've got to be able to feel this before you can fix it. You know, if you just want to tick a box and say, okay, we need to be more inclusive, we need to change our culture, we're going to input X, Y, and Z, but actually not live that through their values, then, you know, that's not going to change anything, because there isn't any quick fix. It's a process. It's a process. So it needs to, you know, you need to be able to feel it to want to fix it, and then really be invested in going there and fixing that through the values that your organization lives and represent. And that, you know, that should be the way, there's the starting point for creating this inclusive culture.
I think that's really great. I love that.
No,
fix it, feel it to fix it.
Yeah.
Very much so. And I think there's that commitment, you know, from top down and also bottom up as well. You know, it's about having that buy-in, that collective buy-in, because otherwise, like you said, if there's not that genuine commitment to want to change and see a difference in your organization, and you don't get the buy-in from all levels, then it's going to be something that's completely difficult to implement as well.
Yeah,
100%. It's everyone's responsibility, right? It's not just from the top down, or it's not just HR, for example. It's got to be, everyone's got to be bought into it to make it work.
Yeah, and it's about looking beneath the policies, which could be perfect, to see what's really then hampering those policies in being lived fully.